QE2 has been launched. The Fed announcing they're going to buy $600 billion of securities. I'm joined now by Axel Merck. He's president of Merck Mutual Funds. And Axel, for those of us who aren't so familiar, what exactly is quantitative easing? What does this mean?
It's a fancy word for printing money. That's as simple as it is. When the Federal Reserve buys something, be that a typewriter, be that paying a salary of an employee, be that buying a government bond, what they do is they enter into the keyboard that we spent this money. The Federal Reserve has the printing press. Now, they don't necessarily need to physically print it. But what happens when they buy a bond from an investment bank, they say, all right, you now have a deposit of $1,000, of $1 million.
And you do an electronic transfer from the
Fed
Well,
exactly. You now have a deposit. Goldman Sachs now has a deposit of $1 million at the Federal Reserve. That money came from nowhere. It's just a computer entry. And Goldman Sachs can take that money away, spend it in the real economy. And that's as simple as it is. It is really money created out of thin air. That's why it tends to weaken the currency. You create more money, well, the value of that money becomes less. That's also why it's called bailing out the government, that you monetize the debt. That means the government, the Federal Reserve is buying the government debt.
Right, so
Congress spends it, and then...
Let's suppose that because the Fed is actually a private institution. It's not an arm of the government. So they're buying treasuries from the U.S. government, and I've heard people describe, it's borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. Is it essentially that, or is it the Fed acting as the lender of last resort to the U.S. government?
It's much more than that, because they literally create more money. It's not, and that's why the U.S. can never really default on its debt, because they just print more. That it may not be worth much, the dollar, but it is simply creating more. And what happens is that the Federal Reserve starts financing the government deficit. The Congress spends the money, and the Federal Reserve prints the money. It's a very cordial relationship. The Federal Reserve, as you point out, is a private institution. It's a membership. It's a club of the banks, and they own it. There's some political interference in that process, but ultimately, Congress doesn't really like to change it because they love it that the Federal Reserve can come in and bail them out.
Right, because Congress, we know, no matter what they say, they do like to spend money. So do you think this is a Ponzi scheme? I mean, that's how some people have described it as well.
Of course it's a Ponzi scheme, but it's a global Ponzi scheme because it's being worked on around the world. That is why you need to have fairly prudent people at the Federal Reserve, unless you go back to something like a gold standard. It's not going to happen overnight, if at all. And so that is why you have a couple of folks who are supposed to be independent who say that inflation is not supposed to happen. Now we have a Fed chairman who wants to have inflation. Herning, who dissented, he says a little deflation is now worth a little bit inflation. I tend to agree with that, but that is not the mindset, and any dissent has been steamrolled over in recent weeks. The Federal Reserve wants to have inflation, and mind you, inflation is a factor of inflation expectations.
Right.
And that may sound complicated, but it is in the hands of the Federal Reserve to manage those expectations. They control the printing press. If the Fed wants to have inflation, they will get inflation.
Right. Well, I think at the consumer level, it's the idea that if I want to buy a TV today, and I'm worried about inflation tomorrow, I'm going to buy it now because tomorrow the $1,000 TV might cost me $1,300 or something.
Sure. Let's think about it. In the past, sometimes the Federal Reserve has been credited of beating inflation. That doesn't mean we go back to the price level of the early 70s when we beat it in the 80s. It means we're plateauing out. So what we're going to get is a bout of inflation. If everything works perfectly, we'll stabilize. If things don't work so well, then all bets are off. And so it's a very, very dangerous game to go on. But if you ask the original question, quantitative easing is printing of money. As simple as that.